Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere on the 18th of April in 75.
So, as the sun goes down on Boston on April 18th, 1775, a number of plans are set in motion and a number of people are standing by, and all the tensions that have been growing with Great Britain since the 1760s are about to explode. The British Commander General Gage had ordered a number of raids across the countryside to seize gunpowder and other weaponry from the colonists.
In September of 1774, the British regulars would sail from Boston over here, down the Mystic River towards Somerville, and seize the gunpowder stored here.
The old Powderhouse in Somerville had one of the largest caches of gunpowder in New England. The British raid had been carried out without incident, but rumors quickly spread that 6 colonists had been killed in some kind of confrontation, and soon up to 20,000 militiamen from the area converged on Cambridge and Boston. The powder alarm, as it became known, forced the resignation of several British officials, but overall it ended peacefully. In some ways, though, it acted as a dress rehearsal for events that we would see about 6 months later in April of 1775. General Gage hoped that seizing gunpowder from the colonists would help quell the unrest seen in the Boston area, but of course it ended up having the opposite result. Chemistry in the colonial era was rudimentary, and gunpowder was notoriously difficult to make, and in fact most of the gunpowder mills in the colonies had shut down after the French and Indian War, so gunpowder was mostly imported from Europe. Gunpowder only has 3 ingredients to it. It's charcoal, sulfur, and then saltpeter. But this is the tricky part. Saltpeter is potassium nitrate, and in 1775, scientists didn't even know that potassium or nitrogen existed. The most common way to get saltpeter in those days was a little bit messy. As tensions had steadily risen with England since the 1760s, the colonists had set up various local government entities like the Committee of Correspondence and the Committee of Safety. This gunpowder incident became especially alarming. A member of these committees was Joseph Warren, a well-liked and respected doctor from Boston. Here's Joseph Warren's portrait at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Especially concerning to Joseph Warren was the lack of an organized response to the British raid, and he was determined that that not happen again.
Which brings us to April 1775. Joseph Warren enlists messengers to sound the alarm in case of another British raid. One of those men was, of course, Paul Revere. Revere was locally famous in Boston, but he never rose to the status of a founding father like John Adams or Benjamin Franklin.
In fact, this portrait of Revere that you can find at the MFA sat in the family attic gathering dust for many, many years. Most of the reason we remember him today is because of a poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Paul Revere's Ride was published in the Atlantic Monthly in January of 1861, and this is what brings Revere to national prominence. The poem is republished in 1863 under the title The Landlord's Tale in Longfellow's collection Tales from the Wayside Inn. So nobody says the British are coming.
The British are coming! The British are coming!
In fact, Longfellow doesn't even say the British are coming within the poem. Near as I can tell, the first time we hear the phrase the British are coming is from this book, Stories of American History, which was a textbook for school children. And on page 82, Paul Revere says the British are coming.
Now at this point, I think most people know there's more than one rider that night. In fact, there were 2, and then 3. And altogether, along their routes, many others whose names are lost to history took their own rides. It's estimated that up to 40 riders were active that night. The second rider from Boston that night was William Dawes. And as far as I know, there are no statues of William Dawes or portraits of Dawes hanging in a Boston museum. All we really have is this bus stop in Harvard Square. If you turn around, you'll see a bunch of horseshoes on the ground here, and it'll mark that it's William Dawes' route to Lexington. We'll get back to William Dawes in a moment, but let's take a closer look at the statue. This statue was created by Cyrus Dallin and dedicated in 1940.
Dallin also sculpted Anne Hutchinson, which you can find in front of the Massachusetts State House, and William Bradford, which is very close to Plymouth Rock. Dallin lived in Arlington, Massachusetts. He might be better known for his work depicting Native Americans. This sculpture of Massasoit can also be found in Plymouth, just up the hill from William Bradford.
Dallin's most noted work might be this one here. This is All Hail the Great Spirit. It was installed in front of the MFA in 1908. Dallin won the contract to sculpt Paul Revere in 1883 when he was 22. But over the years, 6 of his models were rejected. And the statue we see here wouldn't be approved until 1939. And when it was installed in 1940, Dallin would be 79 years old. The statue sits in the Paul Revere Mall, which is just in the shadow of the Old North Church right there. So the Paul Revere Mall is just uphill and a block over from Paul Revere's house.
This is the Paul Revere home, built in about 1680. This is the oldest home in Boston. The home is built on land that was once occupied by the parsonage for the Second Church of Christ, which was known as the Old North Church.
Not to be confused with this Old North Church, which is going to play an important part in the story.
That other Old North Church is connected to Increase and Cotton Mather, who played important roles in the Salem witch trials.
So at some point, Hanover Street stretched from the north end over this way, and Joseph Warren's house was right there where the sand pile is. So from somewhere where he lived over here, the Old North Church is just that right there. William Dawes lived in a seedier section of the north end called St. Anne Street.
Paul Revere worked as a silversmith, as you can see in this portrait done by John Singleton Copley in the 1760s. In the economic downturn following the French and Indian War, Revere would turn to engraving to make extra money. Most famously, he engraved this image of the Boston Massacre. So, in another case of history remembering Paul Revere, not the other people involved, the original drawing for this Boston Massacre image was actually done by a man named Henry Pelham. Henry Pelham was the half-brother of John Singleton Copley, and you'll actually find a portrait of Pelham in the same area of the Museum of Fine Arts that you'll find Joseph Warren and Paul Revere. He's better known as the boy with the flying squirrel.
For a short time, Revere also works as a dentist, and one of his patients was Joseph Warren.
William Dawes was a tanner, which meant he worked with animal hides and leather. He was also a member of the Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company of Massachusetts. The company still exists, and they make their headquarters at Faneuil Hall, where they maintain a military museum up on the 3rd floor.
In 1774, Dawes planned a break-in at a gun house here on the Common. He stole 2 small brass cannons, which were hid in a nearby schoolhouse.
During the raid, William Dawes hurt his hand, and he was treated by Dr. Joseph Warren. Initially, Warren asked Dawes how he had hurt his hand, but knowing of the theft of the cannon, he changed his mind and told Dawes that it was probably better if he didn't know. So, bringing these 3 men together, Joseph Warren was a dental patient of Paul Revere, and William Dawes was a patient of Joseph Warren. All 3 men were also Freemasons. It's known that Revere and Warren were members of the Lodge of St. Andrew, but history doesn't record which lodge Dawes was a part of. Joseph Warren and Paul Revere were also members of the Sons of Liberty. The Green Dragon Tavern was a hangout of the Lodge of St. Andrew Freemasons as well as the Sons of Liberty.
The original Green Dragon Tavern was on Union Street, but that was torn down in 1864. This bar on Blackstone Street carries on its name.
It's thought that the Green Dragon got its name from a copper dragon on the facade that had patinaed over the years.
Speaking of copper, in his later years, Revere founded the first copper rolling factory in the United States, here in Canton, Massachusetts. You'll find a historic plaque naming this as the birthplace of the U.S. copper industry. Revere copper plating was used on the hull of the USS Constitution. Copper plating would protect against barnacles and shipworms that would eat the wood. The original dome of the Massachusetts State House was covered in Paul Revere copper. Founded in 1801, the Revere Copper and Brass Company is still in business, based in Rome, New York. At the Granary Burying Ground, there's a medallion in front of Revere's tomb, signifying his involvement in the Boston Tea Party. Members of the Lodge of St. Andrew and or the Sons of Liberty put together plans for dumping tea into the harbor at the Green Dragon. While it's likely Revere was involved in the planning, whether he took part that night is unclear.
What is known is that he was tasked with spreading the news of the Tea Party to New York. This is the first recorded time Revere acted as a messenger. After this, he acted as a messenger for Joseph Warren in the Committee of Correspondence, and his role was high profile enough to be mentioned in London newspapers.
Moving back to April 1775, it was known that Thomas Gage was planning another raid on the countryside, this time in Concord. One version of history states the plans were overheard at the Green Dragon by members of the Sons of Liberty.
Another version says it was Thomas Gage's American-born wife that passed the information on to Dr. Warren. In any case, Joseph Warren enlists Paul Revere and William Dawes to ride out of Boston and warn the countryside when the raid is launched. There was a concern that part of the raid involved an arrest warrant for John Hancock and Samuel Adams. The men were staying at this house in Lexington. Paul Revere came up with the idea to hang lanterns in the Old North Church as a signal. 1 lantern if by land, 2 lanterns if by sea. 1 if by land meant the British were going to march down the neck of Boston. The neck of Boston is where Washington Street would be today. 2 if by sea would mean the regulars would cross the Charles River by boat over to the mainland, which is what they did, and they landed over by Lechmere Point in Cambridge. 2 of the sextons at the Old North Church were involved with hanging the lamps. The first is Robert Newman, who is buried here at Copp's Burying Ground, the other being John Pulling. The lamps were left out for under a minute, but the signal was clear. You can see one of the lamps that's said to have been hung that night in the collection of the Concord Museum. William Dawes left first that night, heading down the neck and then across Roxbury and Brookline. Paul Revere was rowed across the Charles River to Charlestown.
So this is one of the more hidden historic markers along the Freedom Trail. This is the spot where Paul Revere landed in Charlestown. He came across the channel this way, and you'll find the marker just around the corner from the Constitution. This is the Larkin House in Charlestown. John Larkin lent Paul Revere the horse he used that night. Remarkably, Dawes and Revere both reached Lexington around midnight. And they warned Hancock and Adams of the raid before heading off to Concord. On the way to Concord, they're joined by a third rider, Samuel Prescott. So to be honest, there's not that much known about Samuel Prescott. There's a historic marker here in front of what would have been his land or his house here in Concord. It's thought he might have taken part in the raid on Fort Ticonderoga with Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold, and at some point was captured by the British, and he may have died in prison in Nova Scotia. The 3 riders encounter a British patrol at this spot, and Revere is captured. Dawes tries to escape but falls off his horse. He walks back to Lexington, and Samuel Prescott heads on to Concord. Having taken Paul Revere prisoner, the British patrols march him back to Lexington, and as they approach town, they hear church bells and a general alarm, and Paul Revere convinces the patrol that if they keep him, that they will end up in a lot of trouble. So the British patrol lets him go. They do keep his horse, though. John Larkin never does get his horse back that night. So as the sun comes up on the 19th, militiamen from Lexington come out of the Buckman Tavern over there, and they face off against the British on the battle green. A similar scene plays out here at the Old North Bridge in Concord, and the American Revolution is underway. After the war, Paul Revere would continue on as a successful businessman. He ran the copper rolling mill with his son until his death in 1818. Paul Revere is buried here at the Granary Burial Ground in Boston. Just down the street, you'll find King's Chapel Burial Ground, and there you'll find a marker for William Dawes. Other research suggests that William Dawes might be buried here at Forest Hill Cemetery. Joseph Warren died at Bunker Hill, but we're going to talk about that in a future video. He's buried here at Forest Hill Cemetery in Jamaica Plain. Back at the Granary Burial Ground, if you turn around from Paul Revere's grave and look back at the gate, you'll find the 2 men he was sent to warn that night also buried here. John Hancock's on the right here, and this is Samuel Adams over here on the left. It's said that the Beantown pub here across the street is the only place in the world that you can have a Sam Adams beer across from Sam Adams. Back over at John Hancock, Hancock had the largest signature on the Declaration of Independence, and if you take a look around the rest of the burial ground, he probably has the largest monument here as well.